You're listening to Resistance Radio, the front line against globalist tyranny. You're listening to Resistance Radio.
I'm Jack Sand. After a brief introduction to today's topic, I'll be joined by civil rights activist John Nugent, who himself was a victim of same-sex sexual assault and molestation. The suicides of musicians Chris Cornell, the lead singer of Soundgarden, and Chester Bennington, lead singer from Linkin Park, as well as the death of Stone Temple Pilots Scott Weiland, impacted me a great deal. I grew up listening to all of their music. The music world, the world in general, lost 3 incredible talents. Their families lost 3 caring fathers. I lost 3 of my favorite singers. It's fair to say that all 3 of these men were deeply tortured souls who turned to hard drugs and alcohol when the horrific things they experienced as children got on top of them. The right will immediately attribute their deaths to immorality and lifestyle choice, and the left, the impact of substance abuse, mental health issues, and the usual lack of treatment options for both. But both are wrong. As I'm neither a Christian conservative or a liberal, I'm able to look at these cases objectively, relying on evidence rather than succumbing to dogma. The deaths of these brilliant musicians can be attributed to how society continues to fail young men, how years of same-sex sexual abuse, something that both Scott Weiland and Chester Bennington experienced, and Chris Cornell was rumored to have as well, often result in crippling depression, even suicide. Chester Bennington said that the same-sex sexual abuse left him shattered and vulnerable. He felt alone, and his life was without meaning. That he only regained his confidence when he began self-medicating with alcohol and drugs. In young men, emotional damage caused by familial dysfunction, depression, the side effects of psychiatric medication, being born into a society, a system that's literally rigged against you from day one. In the cases of Bennington and Weiland, they are being victims of gay sexual abuse. Rape perpetrated against young boys by older homosexual males leads to crippling depression and suicide. Suicide rates in young men that have been raped by gay males is 14 times higher than the national average. 14. Rates aren't as high for other types of molestation, although they are as equally abhorrent. As children, both Bennington and Weiland were sexually abused by older men known to them, and there's no denying that, and the impact of the abuse is well documented. In his book, Not Dead and Not for Sale, and in several published interviews since, Scott Weiland told of how he was raped as a 12-year-old by a high school senior who Weiland claimed identified as a homosexual. This man began preying upon him on the school bus, targeting him because of the way he looked. First he would compliment Weiland, and then he invited him back to his home. Weiland then wrote, "At that point the dude raped me. It was quick, not pleasant, and I was too scared to tell anyone. There were threats of violence and bullying." Linkin Park's Chester Bennington reported that he too was abused by an older male. With Bennington, the abuse started even earlier, when the singer was just 7 years of age. Bennington described the perpetrator as a friend of high school age, again, an older male in high school. In an interview last year, Bennington said that things quickly escalated from a touchy, curious thing due to his feeling that he too may be gay to being something far more destructive. Again, Bennington was 7. Forget what public schools tell you. A 7-year-old does not recognize the sexuality, and curiosity is not normal. Bennington then told Kerrang! Magazine that his gay friend's sexual curiosity, that undoubtedly had been piqued by sex ed courses in school that normalized sex amongst children, led to further experimentation. Bennington continued, "Curiosity led to, what does this thing do?" which eventually led to full-on, quote, crazy violations. I was getting beaten up and being forced to do things I didn't want to. I was 7. It destroyed my self-confidence. Like most people, I was so afraid to say anything. I was too afraid to say anything. I didn't want people to think I was gay either, or that I was lying. Again, Bennington was 7 years old, and this was a high school student that was preying upon him. Another male. Bennington continued, "The perpetrator treated me as though he owned me. He would harm me in ways I could not even explain to this day. I had no way to report him as I was scared." The abuse continued until Bennington was 13, some 6 years after it started. It impacted him so much that he, quote, felt the urge to kill everything and run away. That was from the interview in Kerrang! Magazine. To comfort himself, Bennington drew pictures. He wrote poetry and songs. Later, he revealed the abuser's identity to his father, a police detective, but chose not to press charges after he learned the abuser himself was a victim of same-sex sexual abuse. Left-wing indoctrination and the idea that perpetrators are victims themselves clouded Bennington's judgment. As society continues to demand decent people tolerate the intolerable, accept behaviors that were often criminalized just 40 to 50 years ago, aggressive pedophiles and pederasts feel empowered. With the rise of gay rape, we see a rise in suicides. It was reported that Chester Bennington's silence was made worse as his parents divorced. And that is often the case, sadly. Children in fatherless homes where the father is outside the home are oftentimes raped. It seems that is the key statistic. And today we're joined by John Nugent, civil rights activist, and as I mentioned earlier, someone who experienced horrific sexual molestation as well. John, it's good to have you on the program.
Thanks for having me on, and I'm very eager to talk about this from my first-hand experience.
Yeah, it's tragic because, again, although I didn't know these three men personally, and the two of the men I mentioned earlier were sexually assaulted, I find it quite abhorrent that the media is totally discounting the fact that these two men were sexually assaulted in same-sex violations by males older than them in school. And the media is totally ignoring this. They're attributing this to drug addiction and depression and mental illness and the same sorts of nonsense that we always hear. But in reality, those are just symptoms of a far deeper problem. When a 7-year-old boy is sexually assaulted by an older male, they turn to drugs and alcohol. They become mentally unwell. So the initial problem is the rape. It's not the drugs and the alcohol and the depression. It's the rape.
Well, I think what it is an expression of utter contempt for the child. I mean, you become a thing to be sadistically bullied and tortured. I'd rather be hit in the head with a baseball bat than have some guy ram his cock up my behind. It's much more shocking. It blows all the circuits in your brain. The child just can't. It doesn't compute. It doesn't make sense. You can't define it or why. You know, particularly penis up the rectum. It's just so bizarre and sick and weird and horrific and evil. You know, I want to emphasize the molester threatens the child with death. If you talk, I'll kill you. Or I'll come and I'll kill your baby sister too. Nobody will believe you.
This has happened to you?
Yes. And I didn't even face it, what happened to me until I was 49, and I finally got counseling. My second wife asked me why I continued having nightmares. And, you know, I didn't drink too much, but I drank, and I never used pot. And I joined the Marines to be Superman. My father was in the Marines too. And I always said, I'm fine, I'm cool, I'm over it, it's nothing. And sometimes I'd have 1 or 2 violent nightmares a week until I was 49 years old. So none of these BS things like joining the Marines or the Navy SEALs or booze, pot, psych meds, none of that deals with the problem. It just papers it over. But you're still sick, you're still suffering in your unconscious mind. Yeah. And, you know, as horrible as it would be for a girl or a young woman to be raped by a guy, you know, women accept they're smaller, they're petite, they're weak. And a guy will always have the ability to, if he's brutal, to physically overcome a woman, beat her until she submits. But it's so much more shocking for the self-esteem of a boy to be raped by a man. Yeah. It destroys your masculinity. And when I think back to the 3 months I was in Marine Corps boot camp, they have a beautiful graduation book with pictures of all the guys and activities and whatnot. Just looking at the photos of these guys wearing the Marine stress blue uniform and the white hat, the white cover, there's a dead, at least a third of these guys, there's just like this dead look in their eyes. And I know now what that dead look in the eyes of a young man, where that comes from.
And you see that dead look, and unfortunately, in Chris Cornell, and again, we don't know if he was assaulted, but Scott Weiland, I mean, he had that lifeless, dead look to his eyes, and obviously Chester Bennington as well. There's just incredible pain that you can see. It's just a visceral pain. It's on the expression of the face. It's in the eyes. It's remarkable, and you can tell it from a mile away when someone has been abused. And In most of these cases, they came from fatherless homes and they had no one to turn to. And I mentioned fatherless homes because the FBI has done studies on this, and the vast majority of cases of young boys as well as young girls, that there is no father in the home. Obviously, the perpetrator, as you said, he's a criminal first. He's a brutal monster. And they, of course, are systematic, even if they're only 14 or 15. They recognize that when there is no dad about, dad's sometimes bigger than they are, and dad can hurt them. They know it's easier target. So oftentimes they prey upon people who do not have fathers, or whose fathers are, perhaps distant or not around as often. In the case of Bennington, parents were divorced, and his father was a police detective. So I'm assuming he was quite a masculine, father figure, but he was working 16 hours a day, apparently. And Bennington was actually sexually assaulted at his father's home when the father was away working. So in a two-parent home, the mom will be typically, I give you a perfect example. When I was a little kid, there was a strange character who lived down the street from us, and my father would always say, keep away from him. There's something not right with this guy's eyes. And he was very strange. And one time, when I was probably 7, he came to the house and he pulled his pants down in front of me in the front garden. But my mom and dad one of them was always home. And I remember the second that kid showed up, one of my parents, I don't remember who it was, came to the front door and said, get the F out of here, you effing this, that, and the other, to the kid, and he ran off. They asked me what had happened. I had told them. They went to his house. The guy never came back. Don't know what my parents said. My father was an NRA member. Who knows what he probably said to the man's father. But the kid never came back. But this Chester Bennington didn't have that luxury. There was no two-family home, and he was just totally neglected. And the thing that troubles me the most is that the left, they've created these problems. They've created this illness, this dysfunction in society via no-fault divorce and aggressive feminism. Women have broken the home. Men have just left out of irresponsibility or just not being able to tolerate the situation. And we have a situation where we have an entire generation of broken children, now in their 30s and 40s, some of them. And a lot of them, the victims of sexual abuse. I read a study that said that in the last generation, since the baby boom generation, that sexual abuse of young boys, it's astronomically high. It's something like 5 to 10 times higher than it was. And it's not just because it's being reported more. Look in these two cases. It wasn't reported. It's because society is getting sicker and there is more access. So criminals and pedophiles have access to children now, where they didn't have them during the 1950s when there was always a mom or dad at the house. So you have access and less accountability in a society that somehow criminalizes victims and defends perpetrators. So you feel sorry for the perpetrator, or perhaps he was a victim himself, and as Bennington refused to press charges because he felt that the guy may have been a victim himself. It's unbelievable. We have been conditioned to tolerate the intolerable and to view perpetrators as victims. And the way this is headed, I think we're going to have an entire generation of completely dysfunctional children, many of whom will have been sexually assaulted.
Yeah, well, there's no doubt about it. There has to be a spiritual approach. Meds, booze, none of this is going to do it. They don't address the really metaphysical, religious questions like, is there a God? Why is there so much evil in the world? Why do bad things happen to good people, like innocent kids? Why do evil people become evil politicians and take over entertainment industry? And, evil people seem to have the upper hand.
They do, yeah.
Well, these are big cosmic questions, which taking a tranquilizer or antidepressant are not going to fix.
No.
And I've been very helped by the books of Eckhart Tolle, such as The Power of Now. And that first book, he's a German, but he writes an incredible, he writes as well in English as Shakespeare. He sold 5 million copies of The Power of Now. The second book, A New Earth, sold 4 million copies. It's heavy, deep stuff. It's not fluff, new agey fluff. That's, pyramids and crystals and incense and stuff and chimes. It's none of that stuff. It's really down to earth. And what he says is, you have to almost view your mind as your enemy because your mind is stuck in a horrific past. People today are tormented because they're either living in the past, full of anger and grief and remorse and resentment, or they're living in a future full of dread. Will I get fired tomorrow? Will I ever get a girlfriend? Whatever. And they can't enjoy the present.
No.
So somebody like Bennington or Weiland, even when they're performing their songs, there's this soundtrack of rape and tears and grief and humiliation. It's always playing in their unconscious mind. They have never left the past. The past is dogging them. I've got something called cognitive behavioral therapy, and the whole basis of it is to say, look, are you being molested now? You're 47 years old. Are you still being molested? No. Then does it make sense to have something that stopped happening 30 years ago still be ruining your life? And do you want to give the molester that satisfaction that he has effed you up in your mind for the rest of your life? Do you want him to have that satisfaction? The guy could be dead, and you're still torturing yourself with these memories. Because you're not living in the now.
Do you feel that society is sadly creating a situation where pedophiles have a free run of the place now? I mean, when you were a kid, you were about 60 years of age. Obviously, you were assaulted, but it seemed a taboo subject, pedophilia, back in the 1950s and 60s. But today, it seems that sexual assault is just such common, and it's such a common thing, and people just don't seem to even blink when they hear about it.
Well, not only that, but there's a very sinister movements to call it minor attraction or minor orientation, and to say, it's just like, some guy may be attracted to legs or breasts or dark hair or blondes. Some guys are just turned on by kids.
It's disgusting. It's truly evil.
Just their orientation, they claim. And so, in fact, I think it was at Cambridge University in England, there was a whole conference on normalizing pedophilia. It's just another orientation.
And this is the left-wing takeover of the sciences and of academia and the media and the school system.
Yeah. I have to say, for all the many women who have been listening to the show today, it's also devastating on kids when girls. I taught French at a high school in Rhode Island, Coventry, Rhode Island. It's a very depressed town. All the factories had closed up, and the jobs went to China. And it was right next to a town, West Warwick, where a nightclub had burned down about 12, 13 years ago. And 100 kids were killed. The rock band had set off sparklers, and they were kind of a light show. And the sparklers hit the ceiling, acoustic ceiling tiles. And they were flammable, completely illegal, flammable ceiling tiles. The whole place went up, and the greedy owners had padlocked both emergency exits. Because, kids would sometimes open the emergency exit and let their buddies sneak in to avoid the cover charge for a live band.
Of course, yeah.
So 100 kids were killed. So this is a downtrodden, very poor town in Rhode Island. And anyways, I took over a French class, and the French teacher had a nervous breakdown in class. So just another sign of what a screwed up society we have. The teacher went to pieces in class. I took over the class because I speak fluent French, and many of the kids had French-Canadian names, nice kids. There was one beautiful girl named Rachel. I hope she's okay today. Just beautiful. Long hair like in the 1960s, 60s style, down to her hips. And she would not do any classwork. She would not turn in any homework. And one day, she didn't even sit in her assigned seat. She sat way in the back at the bottom, and then the back right of the classroom, in the last desk. And there was one kid, every teacher has one sort of go-to kid. You can ask him about other kids. What's going on with that kid? What do you know? He just shrugged his shoulders and said, I don't know. Mr. Nugent did. It's definitely something now. And he looked at me like, oh my God, that kid is really messed up. And I remember I walked back toward her. I assigned the other kids some French stuff to do in class. And I walked back her, and she started sobbing. And she had her forehead on the desk, and she wouldn't talk to me. Well, anyways, a couple of weeks later, it was a parent-teacher night. And, really active parents who care about their kids, the parents come in. In this case, it was just the mother, no dad in the house. And a very attractive woman. And I asked her, so who's home when Rachel, gets home with the bus in the afternoon? She says, I'm not there. I says, I drive a limo, 3 p.m. to midnight. She said, so there's nobody home? And she says, no, just my boyfriend. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it does seem that way, that when the biological father is not in the home, the predators find their way into the home. That's oftentimes the case. Like I said earlier, the FBI statistics just demonstrate that the key to almost all dysfunction in children is the breakdown of the family. It just transcends all racial demographics and economic backgrounds. Doesn't matter if you're rich or poor. If you have a solid family background, typically kids do better from those backgrounds. And children from broken families end up in prison. The vast majority of rapists come from single mother households. Just an interesting statistic that I read in the FBI report at the end of last year on rapes, that the vast majority of rapists were raised by single mothers. That's the case in the black community with murderers. So it comes down to here that we've re-engineered society to conform to this obviously modern version of the way the cultural Marxists view society. And it's not working. We're finding our children being taken advantage of, children being let down. Well, cultural Marxism is a branch of Marxist ideology originally formulated by the Frankfurt School. Origins in the early part of the 20th century. The central idea of cultural Marxism is to basically soften up and prepare Western civilization for collapse so they can take over with economic Marxism, which really is the group of Marxist elite replacing the capitalists at the top of the food chain. Although they dress it up as a class struggle, the working class people versus the upper classes and the industrialists and the capitalists, in reality it's just these group of individuals, the Marxists, looking to take the wealth from the people at the top. Just theft, basically. So cultural Marxism is the intentional attack on Western culture, including schools, literature, art and film, traditional religious values, the family, which is the most important aspect as we're discussing today, sexual norms, and these attacks are relentless, and they're usually framed in Marxist terms as a class struggle between oppressed and oppressors, or non-whites versus whites, or heterosexuals versus homosexuals. And the victim class typically includes women, minorities, homosexuals, adherents of non-Western religions such as Islam. As you've seen recently, Islam has been weaponized in the West by the left to attack Western society. And that's cultural Marxism.
Well, there's the acceptance of divorce. My formative years were 50s and especially the 1960s. And, the divorce was absolutely taboo. It made you a loser, you were a failure. I mean, you had, after all, married in a church, and you had promised, till death do us part, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, for as long as we both shall live. And you're promising this to God, the creator of the universe, in a church in front of a minister with the Bible open. And you're putting a gold ring on your fiance's finger, and she's put a wedding ring on yours. And now you're married in the eyes of God and man. And people, men get all sweaty and nervous the day of the wedding because you were marrying that woman for the rest of your life. It was a sacred obligation to your children and also to society. And they could not become a president of the United States or a U.S. senator if you were divorced. Ronald Reagan was our first president in 200 years to have been divorced. But people forgave him that because, he was an actor. It was the Hollywood crowd. And they went through divorces and marriages like that. And people otherwise, they kind of liked Reagan and they disliked Jimmy Carter. But he was our first divorced president. It was just not acceptable. And even if the husband and wife didn't get along that well, and sometimes the sign of that would be they would sleep in different bedrooms or they weren't even having sex together, but they stayed together for the sake of the kids. The noble sacrifice that people made.
Exactly, yeah. But you can see with obviously the victims of sexual abuse that just the father being present, not that the household was happy. There's no statistic that shows that happier households have less abuse. It's just that the father and the mother remain together. It comes down to something as simple as that children are safer in two-parent homes. And if you look at a lot of these cases, breakdown of the family seems to be the key. And I was going to ask you, so what's behind the breakdown of the family and the breakdown of society, John?
Well, certainly there is the concept of cultural Marxism, and this is the belief that goes back to some communist intellectuals in the 1930s who fled from Germany when Hitler came to power. And they came to New York City and to London, and they created something called cultural Marxism, in other words, to undermine society by destroying the family.
Yeah.
Through drugs, divorce, homosexuality, evil lyrics in rock music, all kinds of things. Yeah. And in the 1960s, this evil flowering really happened. Drug, sex, rock and roll, and rebellion against the older generation, shacking up, just wild sex. And then, of course, the pill came along in 1964, which means there's a very reliable way of having sex without pregnancy. And so ever since the 1960s, my formative years when I was a teenager, there has been an attempt to terminate what has been normal for the last 50,000 years in Western society, which is you have a dad raising you and you have a mom raising you. You have brothers and sisters. Everybody learns to work. Everybody has jobs. You're surrounded by uncles and aunts. And boys grow up to be real men and girls grow up to be real women and gentlemen and ladies with moral standards. And that has been deliberately destroyed, in my opinion.
It's been an interesting conversation. It's, obviously disappointing that it has to be on this topic. The deaths of these three men hit me quite hard. As I said earlier, I suffered a little bit as many young people go through a turbulent period. And thankfully I had good parents as well as my interests, my university, my education. But I also had these three men to listen to, and it's a sad day to know these three men have lost their lives in the last 18 months or so.
Three geniuses,
three good men. Because of a sick society, they lost their lives, and unfortunately many young people like them in the future will go through this same situation. And hopefully we can do something to change that moving forward.
You're listening to Resistance Radio. You're listening to Resistance Radio.